What clandestine force bound every soul beneath Edinburgh Castle's grey ramparts each dawn, stronger than any oath sworn on blade or in blood? Could the fate of James V's kingdom truly hinge on something as humble as a grain of barley? As first light brushed the tops of the battlements, a hush settled over the fields lying in the castle's shadow. Morning mists clung to emerald stalks of barley and rye, trembling in the salt-tinged breeze off the Firth of Forth. At that hour, when most nobles still slumbered in silk-lined chambers, farmers knelt among the dew-drenched rows, wielding scythes passed down through generations. Yet the harvest itself was fueled by a decree more revolutionary than any military maneuver. James V had proclaimed that every stock grown within cannon shot of his fortress would be exempt from taxation. In that single stroke of royal pen, he wove an unbreakable tether between palace and peasant, for no army could hold fast against a people sustained by hunger. By the time the second cock's crow echoed off the walls, carts creaked and groaned as they rolled under iron portcullises, loaded high with grain. Their burlap sacks bore two seals, the king's lion rampant and the miller's secret guild mark. Though the decree shielded farmers from the king's taxman, it entrusted their loyalty and the city's survival to the hands of powerful millers whose stone wheels ground the grain at Leith. Underneath the castle's looming towers, narrow wines funneled these wagons past bow-armed sentries whose iron scales weighed each sack with unerring precision. For in an age when siege by starvation was as deadly as any sword, control of flour meant control of life itself. An hour later, tidal waters surged beneath great wooden flumes, turning overshot wheels that submerged millstones deep in the river's roar. Millwrights, dark with grease and sweat, embroidered each stone's face with chiseled grooves. No superficial millwork could ensure the gentle crushing of kernels. A too rapid grind brought heat, and with it rancid flour that turned loaves into stomach-turning charcoal. Conversely, a measured pace coaxed from barley and rye their sweetest humors, preserving oils and aroma for the ovens to unlock. Within the empty hulls of harvested grain lay the power to build empires, or starve them. Meanwhile, within the tangled back streets below the castle, the next act of this daily drama was already stirring. Dim hearth fires still glowed orange in weathered bakehouses, their stone floors blackened by centuries of flame. There, atop lopsided beams, sat wooden vats harboring the living starter, an heirloom yeast culture nurtured since antiquity. By tradition, each vat was named for its first matron, tying modern bakers to the silent nuns of Holyrood Abbey, who, it was said, had first trapped wild yeasts in whey and bran centuries ago. When the miller's carts rumbled past, bakers lifted a ladle of foaming starter and fed it with freshly milled flour and cool crystal water drawn from the castle's deepest well. With a whisper that combined supplication and incantation, by grain and fire, rise and forgive, they folded the mixture into a rough dough, and soon the wooden trough brimmed with life, tiny bubbles tensing like scattered stars across its surface. One too cool mixture languished flat, one too warm fermented into acetic haze, so the starter's mood had to be read as deftly as any monarch's temper. Next came kneading, a ritual of muscle and ritual combined. Bakers pressed the dough heel first, folded it over, then rotated and repeated, 12 cycles in all, echoing the 12 harvest moons that governed the seasons. Apprentices' arms ached from the steady motion, but only through this hands-on devotion could the dough become supple enough to swallow the flames of the oven without collapsing. As each baker worked, neighbors arrived to offer fresh whey, milk, or a pinch of salt, each gift a prayer for health, for bountiful yield, for peace behind those formidable walls. By midday, the slowly rising dough was ready for the grand hearth. At the heart of every bakehouse crouched a beehive oven, its clay dome blackened like the underbelly of a storm cloud. Driftwood from the Firth's shore had been piled inside the previous evening, and only when its embers glowed fiercely did the baker sweep away the ash and smooth the scorching interior with thick gloves. Birch bark, laid to smolder at the mouth, hissed like captive steam, ensuring a crackling crown of crust around each loaf. Without pause, the baker, clad in an apron as grimy as the city's wines, slid 4 perfect rounds of dough onto the glowing stone floor. With a swift cut of a knife, he scored a simple cross atop each one, a sign of blessing, a mark of ownership, and a talisman against misfortune. Then, using a paddle carved with the guild's emblem, he sealed the oven's mouth with wet clay. Only then did the villagers, who had gathered behind parchment windows to watch, let out the breath they had been holding. As steam fogged the front arch, a hush fell over the street. Then, with the first hiss of steam releasing, the baker pried open the door. A plume of fragrant vapor, smoky barley, sweet rye, and the faint tang of living yeast rolled down the steps and wound through the wines like a slow, triumphal march. He tapped the bottom of a loaf with a wooden spoon. A hollow thunk like a drumbeat heralded success. From that moment, a new caravan formed. Loaves lifted in linen baskets, carried past the guardhouse where soldiers broke fragments in half before dawn watch, and on to the lawn market, where every baker's cross served as a silent assurance of purity. Here, peasants handed copper pennies to taste the king's mercy baked into each crust. Merchants bartered bulk rations for livestock. Noble families in travel cloaks paused to inhale the aroma of a people's ritual. And though no trumpet sounded, the kingdom had already witnessed its greatest triumph of the day, one born of grain, water, fire, and the unwavering devotion of those whose humble craft held the realm together. In the ebb and flow of harvest and taxation, of millstones turning and hearths blazing, the true heart of James V's Scotland lay not in splintered pikes or gleaming armor, but in the simple miracle of bread. Each morning beneath the gray ramparts, an unseen covenant was renewed. The people's loyalty in exchange for sustenance, the king's protection in exchange for mercy on their grain. And so the loaf, humble and unassuming, became the strongest force in the land, binding ordinary hands and noble hearts alike in a secret that no siege could break. Before the castle's first bells tolled midday, the true drama of fortress bread unfolded within the cramped, soot-blackened bakehouses tucked into Edinburgh's winding wines. Here, beneath low timber beams and over stone floors slick with flour, bakers embarked on the second act of their daily ritual, transforming pale dough into golden loaves that would carry the kingdom's secret through every kitchen, tavern, and guardhouse. Inside one such bakehouse, the air rippled with heat. A single high-arched hearth dominated the rear wall, its clay dome blackened by centuries of fire. In the center, embers glowed like dying coals, awaiting the baker's careful tending. Each morning, before the sun crested distant hills, driftwood harvested from the Firth's shores was piled and ignited within this beehive oven. As flames curled up its interior, the dome began to radiate a fierce, steady heat, an ember-red glow that promised crackling crusts and tender crumbs. Yet while fire built to its peak, the real heart of the bakehouse lay elsewhere, the wooden trough beside the hearth, where dough rose and fell like a living thing. Having fed the living starter with flour and well water at dawn, bakers returned now to coax the swollen mass toward its final shape. They pressed down on the dough with calloused heels, folding it over in a precise sequence of 12 motions, each fold a heartbeat in a ritual passed from master to apprentice. Between cycles, dough was left to rest under linen cloths, its surface mottled with bubbles that signaled fermentation's secret work. Meanwhile, apprentices scurried to fetch birch bark and bundles of fresh rosemary and thyme from the nearby herb loft, where fragrant garlands hung drying from rough beams. A baker's intuition determined how much of each to fold into festival loaves. A handful of herbs for a simple morning batch, a braid of rosemary sprigs pressed into dough for a high feast. As the oven's glow deepened, the baker swept aside the smoldering embers with a long steel rake. The heat was more than physical, it hummed with expectation. Birch bark lay in neat stacks at the oven's mouth. Once touched by flame, it would smolder and hiss, releasing steam that would give every loaf a crackling crown. With deft precision, the baker divided the dough into even rounds, their weights measured on an iron-ledged table whose edges were scarred by decades of nicks and cuts. One by one, loaves were placed on a floured paddle and slid into the oven. Each vanished into ember-red darkness with a soft thump. Before sealing the entrance, the baker wielded a small blade to score a cross atop every loaf, an ancient symbol invoking protection and staking claim. In the flicker of torchlight, these crosses gleamed wet on dough's surface, legacies inscribed in wheat and water. Sealed by a plaster of mud and straw, the oven door held in the heat. At that moment, a hush fell over the workshop. The only sound was the distant drip of water from a leaky roof and the steady hiss of steam escaping from cracks in the clay. Apprentices and neighbors alike stood in quiet reverence. The baking had begun, and no one dared break the silence that honored fire's alchemy. Outside, the day pressed on. The castle's guards took midday meals, dipping chunks of bread into bowls of thin ale or thick pottage. In taverns, customers clinked wooden tankards, dunking crusty wedges into savory stews. Yet none knew the full tale unfolding behind that humble oven door. How every ember was coaxed, every fold pressed, every herb chosen with devotion and care. Nearly an hour passed before the baker returned. First, he tapped a loaf with a wooden spoon. A hollow knock like a distant drum signaled perfection. Then, with gauntleted hands, he pried open the door. A billow of steam cascaded out, carrying the heady aroma of smoke-kissed grain and herbal warmth. Loaves emerged, bronze and crackling, their crusts flecked with bran and dusted with flour. He stacked them on rush-lined baskets, the loaves' warmth seeping into the woven reeds. Apprentices covered each batch with linen cloths to preserve heat. Moments later, the bakehouse door swung wide, revealing a queue of villagers bearing copper pennies, small baskets, or simple cloth sacks. The baker's apprentice called out, "Loaves of barley, loaves of rye, loaves studded with rosemary," his voice carrying excitement into the narrow street. Yet even as the first customer paid, the baker's work was not done. From a corner shelf, he retrieved a small wooden box containing festival loaves, intricately braided rings of dough woven with lavender sprigs and threads of honey. These would be reserved for special offerings: a loaf presented at the castle's midday council, a wreath carried in procession to St. Giles's Church, a gift for a traveling noble's retinue. By afternoon, the bakehouse fell quiet once more. Ember heat waned and the air cooled. Leftover scraps, chubby rolls nibbled by apprentices, were crumbled into morning porridge or tossed to farmyard hens. The oven's belly, now a bed of ashes, breathed its last warmth through the soot-blackened arch. As dusk approached, lanterns flickered along the wines, and smoke curled lazily from cottage chimneys. Inside the bakehouse, the baker paused by the empty oven, resting a flour-dusted hand on the clay dome. Today's ritual had concluded, the loaves borne off to kitchens and markets, a silent victory for king and commoner alike. Yet he knew tomorrow would come, and with it a new dawn, another decree's promise, another breath of life from living yeast and hearth-born flame. As the sun climbed high above Edinburgh Castle's ramparts, the freshly baked loaves, still warm from the beehive ovens, embarked on the final leg of their journey. From the bakehouse's narrow door, they passed into the bustling lawn market, where the scent of steam-laden crust mingled with salt air drifting down from the firth. Here, under the watchful gaze of stone sentinels, the kingdom's true communion unfolded. Soldiers, merchants, and commoners alike converged in a silent ceremony of exchange and sustenance. First to arrive were the castle guards, their leather boots clicking on cobblestones as they formed a respectful queue. In one hand, each carried a chipped wooden bowl, in the other, a handful of copper pennies. They broke the loaves in half, two rough-edged morsels that would fuel a long watch atop the battlements, and dipped them into bowls of thin ale or smoky pottage. With every bite, they sealed the covenant between defender and domain, the king's mercy on grain in exchange for unwavering loyalty on the walls. Meanwhile, tavern keepers from the grass market bustled through the crowd, baskets slung over their shoulders. Each clasped a loaf beneath his arm, bound for smoky rooms where travelers, laborers, and merchants would dunk crusts into stews thick with salted beef and root vegetables. In these low-ceilinged inns, hearth fires roared, and the fortress bread, its crumb dense, its crust crackling, became both currency and comfort, erasing social lines as easily as steam erased the morning mist. By midday, the marketplace transformed into a grand festival. Bakers unveiled special feast loaves, braided wreaths woven with lavender from Holyrood's gardens and honeycombs traded from the borders. These ornate rings, gilded by threads of saffron smuggled from Flanders, were passed in ceremonial procession to St. Giles's Church, where they were blessed and then broken among the congregation. In a ritual dating back generations, a loaf would be presented to the castle's council chamber, its first slice offered to the queen's steward and its last to the poorest beggar by the city gate, a testament to the kingdom's promised equity. Yet even as festival music filled the air, darker stories whispered through the stalls. Tales persisted of a baker's apprentice who once slipped a poisoned loaf into the garrison stores. A plot foiled only by the baker's precise scoring of the cross, which she recognized as her master's alone. Rumor had it that James V himself patrolled the lawn market in peasant's garb, testing loaves for authenticity and quality. When a humble cottage baker realized he had served his king, the royal seal was quietly granted to her scored cross, elevating it from mere mark of ownership to ensign of sovereign approval. As afternoon waned, merchants loaded surplus loaves back onto carts bound for outlying villages, where the same grain exemption ensured no farmstead stood empty of bread. In every hamlet from Leith to Linlithgow, the tide of fortress loaves sustained hearth and home. Children ran beside the wagons, their arms wrapped in linen to protect swaddled loaves from sun and rain. Mothers broke slices for hungry mouths. Elders crumbled crumbs into savory broths. Smiths at forge and anvil paused to dip hard bread into mugs of cold ale before returning to the ring of hammer on iron. Long after the last loaf left the market, the bakehouse stood silent. Its ovens cooled, embers fading to ash, and its troughs wiped clean of dough's remnants. Yet the bond the bread forged endured. In the years that followed, through sieges, reformations, and royal coronations, the ritual of dawn baking remained sacrosanct, a constant amid upheaval. Centuries later, when industrial mills and commercial yeast rendered tidal stones and living starters nearly obsolete, a revival stirred among artisan bakers. In modern bakehouses across Edinburgh, small beehive ovens have been reconstructed from historical plans. Starters are cultivated through lantern-lit workshops, and heritage grains, bare barley, oat rye, emmer wheat, are milled by hand. Guests at culinary festivals taste festival wreaths braided with lavender. Reenactors knead dough according to the 12-fold sequence once taught in medieval guilds, and historians toast with cups of barley ale brewed from the very grains once protected by James V's decree. In every crackling crust and tender crumb of these revived loaves, the kingdom's secret lingers, that true power rests not in swords or thrones, but in the humble art of bread-making. Beneath Edinburgh Castle's grey ramparts, a single royal decree set in motion tides of grain and waves of dough, whose echoes still rise each dawn. And so, through flame and flour, starter and steam, the legacy of James V's mercy endures, a testament to the enduring truth that a loaf of bread can bind a kingdom together, one slice at a time.